The Black Sox scandal resulted in the banishment of 8 Chicago players, including shoeless Joe Jackson, the man with the 3rd highest career batting average of all time. The effect of the Black Sox scandal is still being felt today as we debate the Pete Rose case or any other case in any sport involving betting.
When the World Series was ready to occur, people really expected the Chicago White Sox to beat the Cincinnati Reds. They were a clear favorite.
The fact is, they had won the pennant and a World Series in 1917, just 2 years prior.
Ty Cobb once told me that shoeless Joe Jackson was the finest pure hitter he'd ever seen in his life.
For a World Series, you need pitching, and they had pitching. Eddie Seacott and Lefty Williams were both 20-game winners.
Yet as Game 1 of the best-of-9 approached, the odds began to shift in favor of the Reds. Suspicions of a fix were in the air.
Those kind of rumors happened every October. What was different about October of 1919 was that the betting went in that direction too, that a lot of smart money, big money, was going down on the Reds.
The results of Games 1 and 2, which were played in Cincinnati, gave weight to the rumors.
Seacott got knocked out 9-1 Reds in the first game. The second game, a very close game. Lefty Williams loses at 4-2.
The third game, the White Sox won. Then the pattern repeated itself, where the first 2 pitchers, Lefty Williams and Eddie Seacott, who normally won, lost their 2 games.
The White Sox, down 4-1, were on the brink of losing the best-of-9 series. But poor pitching from their aces was not the only reason. Their main RBI man, shoeless Joe Jackson, whose 96 were 3rd in the majors during the regular season, was not productive in the clutch.
In the first 5 games, he came to bat with 10 runners on base, total of 10 in the first 5 games, 6 of whom were in scoring position, and he never drove in a run.
He hit the only home run of the series when they were already behind in the last game 5-0. It seemed like Joe did most of his damage with the bat when the games were already out of hand.
Cincinnati won the series in 8 games, with its 5 victories coming when either Seacott or Williams started for Chicago. Winning bettors were paid off, White Sox fans grumbled, and baseball's grand old music played on. Then, in September of 1920, a Chicago grand jury, convened to consider the evidence on an unrelated charge, learned of possible improprieties with the previous year's World Series.
The grand jury proceeded for a while. Lo and behold, they started opening this can of worms of what had transpired in the fall of 1919. They began to call people in. They put the fear of the Lord into Seacott, into Lefty Williams, and finally into Jackson.
The prosecutor asked if he had agreed to throw the World Series for $20,000, and Joe said yes, he did. And the prosecutor said, did you accept $5,000? And Joe said yes, he did.
On August 2nd, 1921, after just 2 hours and 47 minutes of deliberation, the jury acquitted the players. In January of 1921, the owners named Kennesaw Mountain Landis, a hard-line federal judge, baseball's first commissioner. 2 months later, he suspended Jackson, Seacott, Williams, and 5 other alleged co-conspirators. Among the infamous Chicago 8 was first baseman Chick Gandil, who told Sports Illustrated in 1956 of his connection to Boston gambler Sports Sullivan.
He was the person that apparently was first contacted by Chick Gandil in 1919. Gandil told Sullivan, the players are ready to throw the series and need money.
There were 8 men on a team that were going to make sure that the Chicago White Sox, heavily favored, didn't win the World Series.
They all knew what they were doing. People say, well, gee, Joe Jackson was illiterate. He can't read and he can't write. Well, he knew how to count.
Eddie Collins, who was the White Sox second baseman, later said he had no pity for these players who were evicted. He said they knew what they were doing. There were no excuses because they took a crooked course.
There's no question that the players were guilty. What Landis did was make it very clear that throwing games was a capital crime of baseball.
The way he did that was the 8 players who were involved, he banned for life.
History has been harsh toward the Black Sox. While the players were considered outlaws, with some playing in semi-pro leagues, Joe Jackson was used decades later to romanticize the redemption of a father-son relationship in the novel that spawned the movie Field of Dreams. Even aficionados of the sport are split on how history should judge these men.
Is that overly glamorized?
That's simplified.
Yep.
That it's a nice, clean telling of the story in that little vignette, as most tellings of the Black Sox stories have tended to be over the years, that it was a very complicated story when it first broke, and as it became ever more complicated, the sports writers initially and then the historians later found ways to simplify it, and it came down to us in a nice sort of clean, neat package. There were a couple of untidy pieces to it, but for the most part, you know, the story as it has evolved down through the years has become this nice, clean story of the crooked ball players who agreed to accept the bribe from the gamblers to throw the series and successfully threw the series because the White Sox did indeed lose it. The reality I found was quite a bit more complicated and intricate than that.
In what sense, what's new? So this story's been told many times over in that format. And the editors come and say, gee, Chuck, would you be interested in doing something on the Black Sox scandal? What was new that might have been found out there that triggered this whole reevaluation?
Well, it was a conversation with my editor at Oxford, a man named Tim Bent, who actually came up with the idea for this. He was looking for something that was a pivotal moment in American history. There's an Oxford series, the publisher is Oxford University Press. There's an Oxford series called Pivotal Moments in American History, and he was looking for a sports book that would fit into this. And he said, do you think the Black Sox story is that pivotal moment? And I said yes, that, you know, you look at what baseball was before the Black Sox, which was sort of a loose confederation of independent businesses, and what it became afterwards, which was this, you know, modern governance with a strong central commissioner. And you look at the allegations of gambling before and the fact that they had been fairly well eradicated afterwards. And so I think, yeah, that you can call this a pivotal moment, that certainly sports in the 1920s were much different and much bigger and much better organized than sports before that. And so as we went out, that was the sort of initial intent, was to show how this changed sport. And as I got more into it, I, you know, found interesting aspects that I hadn't really anticipated. And I think chief among those was the hatred, is the only word for it, between Ban Johnson, the president of the American League and the de facto ruler of the game of baseball. He was a member of that three-person national commission that ruled the game, and he was its strongest voice. And Charles Comiskey, the owner of the White Sox, and Ban Johnson's one-time closest friend. That these two men were his closest brothers in the early years of their career. They helped build the American League. They shared an office in the Chicago Loop. Comiskey as president of the White Sox, Johnson as president of the American League. As the relationship deteriorated, that little things became big things, and by 1919, the two men truly loathed each other. And had nothing to do, their relationship had nothing to do with how the fixing of the 1919 World Series came to pass, but it had everything to do with how the investigation, the cover-up, the investigation, the prosecution unplayed after that. That had Charles Comiskey and Ban Johnson not hated one another, we would likely have never heard of the Black Sox story other than as a rumor that the 1919, unconfirmed rumor that the 1919 World Series may have been compromised. That would have been all we would have ever heard, I think, were it not for the antipathy that these two men had for each other.
How did it leak out? The little vignette talked about a 1920 unrelated lawsuit led to some testimony which kind of exploded the story.
Yeah, it was, and it wasn't really even the grand jury initially that led to it. It was a newspaper article half a country away that the rumors about the 1919 World Series sort of percolated during the series and for a few months thereafter, and then they sort of died down. And this was not uncommon at that time. There were all sorts of rumors about game fixing because there was all sorts of game fixing in the early days of the game. Nothing on this scale, but enough that the rumors were received with a grain of salt. And so they percolated, they died down, they sort of bubbled up a couple of times after that, in the months after the World Series. But then when the 1920 season started, everybody moved on. In August of 1920, Bill Veeck, the father of the Bill Veeck who would own the Cleveland Indians and the White Sox, Bill Veeck Sr., who was president of the Cubs, received a phone call. It was the afternoon of August 31st. The fifth-place Cubs were scheduled to play the seventh-place Phillies on a Wednesday afternoon or something, an utterly meaningless game. And Veeck got a phone call, got a number of phone calls and got a number of telegrams that said, watch this afternoon's game, your pitcher is in the tank, heavy money in Detroit betting on Philadelphia. So Bill Veeck had his manager pull the scheduled starting pitcher and offered Grover Cleveland Alexander a bonus if he would win the game. He was unable to do so. But Veeck took that charge seriously enough that he went to the Chicago baseball writers and said, look, investigate this, will you? We need to get to the bottom of this. And the baseball writers said, well, this isn't our job. This is the grand jury's job. And so they wrote stories saying this isn't our job, it's the grand jury's job. The newly appointed newly elected judge overseeing the grand jury was a man who aspired to be the next commissioner of baseball. It was not Kennesaw Landis, it was a man named Charles McDonald. And Charles McDonald went to his great friend, Ban Johnson, and patron. Johnson very much wanted to see McDonald in charge of the game, and said, McDonald asked Johnson, should I do this? Would this help, my chances of being the chairman of the National Commission? And Johnson said yes. And so McDonald announced that the grand jury would look into these allegations of the Cubs-Phillies game being fixed. And so then the writers said, well, as long as they're looking into this, why don't they look into those persistent rumors from last fall and the World Series? McDonald again went to Johnson. Would this help my chances of being commissioner? And Johnson said, oh, yes. And Johnson's thinking all the time, anything that hurts Charles Comiskey is good for me. And so that was how the grand jury got into the business of investigating the 1919 World Series. The early days of the testimony were very quiescent. There wasn't a whole lot happening that people were passing on rumors, but nobody had any firsthand information. And that they were making allegations that Arnold Rothstein, the big New York gambler, was in charge of everything. And in Philadelphia, a semi-pro baseball player and modestly successful ex-prize fighter by the name of Billy Maharg, who had been a woefully inept fixer the year before, had had some contact with some of the players and had been involved in the fix in a tangential way, decided he was going to tell his story. And he went to the Philadelphia North American, a daily newspaper then in Philadelphia, and said, I've got some facts here that nobody else has. And the story was written, one of the bylines in that clip that we just saw was a Philadelphia writer that heard the story, wrote it as a first-person story, didn't ask a whole lot of journalistic questions. It was not, a journalistic tour de force. But the story appeared in the North American, and for the first time, it was somebody who claims to have been in the room with White Sox players when the World Series fix was discussed. And that exploded the whole story. That took it to another level. Which brings us to the morning that will interest most of the people in your audience, because here is where the lawyers get involved. Yeah. The
CLE credits, baby. You feeling it? You feeling it?
The morning after this story appeared, Charles Comiskey, the White Sox owner, went to his lawyer, a man named Alfred Austrian, who had known about Comiskey's suspicions about this. They had worked for a year to cover this up. They had hired private investigators to follow the players after the following World Series, determined that there was no smoking gun and they could go on and sign the players for 1920 and go on. So on this morning, they knew that the whole thing was about to explode, that the grand jury was now going to be calling, different people in, people who would have had firsthand knowledge. And it was incumbent, if Charles Comiskey wasn't going to be swept away in this ruin, that it appeared that he'd be out in front of this, that he'd be the guy leading the charge. So they discussed how best to do this, and it was decided we need to get a player to confess. We need to bring a player to the grand jury. And they asked, there were a number of White Sox officials in the room. One of them was Kid Gleason, the White Sox manager. And Alfred Austrian asked, who is the person most likely to confess to this? And Kid Gleason, it could have only been Kid Gleason, said Seacott. Seacott was the pitcher that was the key to the whole thing. He was 29-8 in 1919. That with Seacott aboard, the fix was viable. Without Seacott, no other combination of White Sox players could have reasonably thought they could have pulled this off. But Seacott wore the shame from what he had done very heavily. That there were reports throughout the 1920 season that, a normally gregarious man, he had withdrawn into himself, was spending an awful lot of time with his priest, and was moody and sullen and affected by this. He still won 20 games in 1920, by the way. Everyone should have pitchers so bothered and distracted. And so they brought Seacott in, and they said, we've got the goods on you. You're about to be indicted, and we want you to tell what you know. We're not going to charge you. We're not interested in prosecuting you. We're only interested in the gamblers. You'll be able to go home tonight. And the burden of what he was bearing and the sort of encouragement that he was getting from Alfred Austrian sort of convinced Seacott that, all right, this is the time I'm going to unburden myself. And so he told the story, named the other players who were involved, and then went over to the grand jury. Interesting that Alfred Austrian had told him, we don't want to prosecute you or any of the players. We will not, nothing you say will be, used against you. And here,
so he's just a corporate attorney.
He was
just a corporate attorney.
He was the corporate attorney. He was not with the state's attorney, though he was in contact with the state's attorney's office. But he was the White Sox attorney. And he said, sign this document. And the document was an immunity waiver. And so Seacott signed it, signed the deposition that he had given before Austrian in his office, and then went over to the grand jury, whereupon he was given another immunity waiver to sign, and signed it, and then confessed. The next person in was Joe Jackson, that they had called Joe Jackson in, and he had spent the morning, he'd gotten a call that Comiskey wants to see you in Alfred Austrian's office. I think the time was early afternoon, and so he went to a bar and had spent the morning drinking, and went to Austrian.
That's witness prep, isn't it, guys?
And so he went to Austrian's office, and the same litany. Austrian said, we've got the goods on you. You're about to be indicted. We're not interested in you. We're interested only in the gamblers. We only want you for testimony that if you tell us what you know, you'll be able to go home. Seacott's got the same deal. Seacott's done gone already. And Jackson at this point said, I really think I should have my own lawyer. And here's the question I've got for everybody in the room, that, what are best practices when somebody who is not your client asks for their own attorney and you're in the course of grilling them on a criminal investigation? Austrian just continued forward. He said, we can do you more good than any attorney. Well, just let me go out and get one. No attorney would come to my office. Well, let me talk to one from your own firm. I can do you more good than any attorney out there. And Jackson went through the same, litany as Seacott. He signed the immunity waiver, signed the deposition that he gave in Austrian's office, and then went down the street to confess in front of the grand jury. It was after his grand jury testimony that the signature moment of this whole scandal happened, or did not happen, depending on your perspective of history. As reported by Hugh Fullerton in the Chicago Record and Examiner, when when Jackson was emerging from the courthouse, and the courthouse was now thronged with people, reporters and kids, and a whole crowd had gathered because this story had already broken. And as Fullerton reported the story, one little urchin pushed his way through the crowd and came up to Jackson and said, "It ain't true, is it, Joe?" And Jackson said, as reported by Fullerton, "Yes, son, I'm afraid it is." And the little urchin said, "Well, I never would have thought it." And that's become the signature moment. And as I said in the book, there's been a lot of speculation as to whether or not it actually happened. Fullerton was the only one who heard it. There were dozens of other reporters there. And the speculation is, and it's not without a lot of credence, that Hugh Fullerton made it up. Nevertheless, it was widely reprinted, widely reported that everybody, liked a good story like this. But even when they were stealing a good story, sometimes reporters couldn't get it right. So "It ain't true, is it, Joe?" became "Say it ain't so, Joe." And that's the phrase that has passed into the language. What I write in the book and what I feel about this episode is that it really doesn't matter whether or not Hugh Fullerton made that up or not, because the whole story is encapsulated right there in those 3 lines. "It ain't true, is it, Joe?" "Yes, son, I'm afraid it is." "Well, I never would have thought it." You've got the innocence of the little boy shattered, even though he sounds a little more perplexed than broken on that. But you've got the the aura of the ball player vanished, stripped of all his dignity. You've got hurt, betrayal, shame, anger, disbelief. That the whole range of emotions that America was feeling are right there in that little vignette. That whether he made it up or not, he nailed it.
As you reflect back on this sort of serendipitous finding of this information, it came kind of through the back door, and in your research, did you find that the Charles Comiskey and his treatment of the players, was that involved in leading to a culture which may have opened itself for his players to make a few extraordinary bucks at the time?
Well, that was... Excuse me here. Try and get closer to that without being on top of it. That's one of the myths of Eight Men Out, which was the most widely read and popular telling of the Black Sox story. Elliot Asanoff book that appeared in 1963. It was, very widely acclaimed and widely read. It was made into a film in 1988. That Elliot Asanoff made no apologies for writing that story in dramatic terms, and when he hit a roadblock in the story, he just made something dramatic up, which was that these players were angry at Charles Comiskey for being so parsimonious and being the cheapest owner in baseball. And Comiskey wasn't any cheaper than anybody else, that he was not an overly generous owner, but neither was anybody else, that the ball players were very poorly paid across the game, that the White Sox players, some of them were less well paid than other players on other teams, but some of them were better paid than other players on other teams. That, Comiskey got away, Comiskey paid players what he needed to pay them to keep them. And so, while Comiskey himself was, I don't think, any more or less harsh in his treatment with his players, the owners, the players were underpaid. They had trouble making a living, and they had to work off-season jobs, and sometimes the off-season jobs paid more than their in-season jobs. And so they were looking for ways to make other money, and they made other money however they could. They would make other money by playing games on Sunday when the major league teams did not play. They would make more money by playing in the month of October and November in the warm weather states. And sometimes they would make other money when a gambler said, "Say, if you don't try your best today, there's $100 in it for you."
Chick Gandil's name came up in the vignette. Chick Gandil is may be the major player of the 8 insofar as to connect to the actual fix itself. you explain a little bit more about how that all happened?
Excuse me. That nobody agrees on what happened over those 8 days in 1919 or over the weeks leading up to that, that everyone has a different take on what the reality was. The one fact that everyone agrees at is that Chick Gandil was at the center of this, that he was the guy who was involved in every conversation. He was the liaison between the gamblers, and the ball players. He was the guy who recruited the players. He was the guy who handled the money, what little there was that came from the gamblers and made its way to the players. And he was the guy that the ball players felt double-crossed the rest of the ball players. The ball players were convinced they were double-crossed, but they felt that it wasn't the gamblers who had double-crossed them. It was Gandil. There's an anecdote that I write in the book that I think sums up how people felt about Chick Gandil, that in that 1919 season, there was a scene where Tris Speaker hit a ground ball to the infield and, slid into first base. And I don't know whether he was safe or out, but he and Gandil came up fighting. And this was a melee that was involved, a history that went beyond everyone, was in agreement, went beyond whatever happened in that first base collision. So everybody gathered around as, it was a baseball fight, but this one was, there were actually two people fighting. The rest of the people were, the baseball fight where they grabbed a hold of each other's jerseys just to make sure, they weren't going to get punched. And the line that I love was after they're going at it, somebody asked one of the umpires who was on the outside of the circle, when are you going to break it up? And said, well, how's it going? It says, well, Speaker's got Gandil down, seems to be getting the better of him. And he says, well, we'll let it go another minute. Gandil's got it coming. And these were his teammates that were letting this sort of happen. So that'll give you. He was a man without a lot of friends during the game, but nevertheless, he was a man who had a certain ability to lead and to put something together.
He's the bridge into the White Sox clubhouse, but obviously this idea got hatched elsewhere. Do you have a sense of the where it all began? Was this, they mentioned Boston, you heard Arnold Rothstein. Do you get a sense in your book as to, in the beginning there was somebody at some office who said, let's fix the 1919 World Series?
There probably was, but the way it came together was that whether it's something as small and sordid as this or something as grand as the American Revolution, that at the beginning it seems to be a ridiculous idea, that the first person to pose such an idea is going to be laughed at. But then people start talking about it, and it becomes that, well, maybe this could happen, and maybe this, what would it need? And they start talking in specifics. And insofar as all of the testimony before the grand jury and at the criminal trial suggests, that was how it came together. That the idea of fixing baseball games was something that was always in the air, that it was a part of the game, had been a part of the game for as long as there had, as long as there had been a professional game. And thank you. And so it would have been a topic that in the normal course of a season, a ball player may have had 1 or 2 or 5 or 6 innocent conversations over, or sometimes not so innocent conversations. So I think that those conversations throughout the 1919 season started between a couple of people who I don't know, but I think probably, it just grew out of these conversations. It would have been a part of the normal course of a ball player's conversation. And as the season went on, they got ever more specific. and they involved particular players and only particular players. By mid-September, the people that would be the Black Sox were talking about the viability of throwing the World Series, and were talking with gamblers about what it would cost those gamblers to do it. And there were meetings in New York. The Sports Sullivan Chick Gandil meeting in a Boston hotel. There was a plaque for years in the Somerset Hotel the Buckminster Hotel in Boston. There was a plaque saying, "In this hotel in September of 1919, the most infamous scandal in baseball history was hatched when Boston gambler James Sports Sullivan met with," and a little plaque in the lobby that they removed when they renovated the place about 10 years ago. So, what I say is what bespeaks history more than a brass plaque. But, the only source of that was Gandil's Sports Illustrated article in 1956, which was riddled with errors and with self-effacing comments. So I'm not even sure that Sullivan talk took place. But there were certainly talks between Sullivan, between Bill Burns, who would be the chief witness for the prosecution, and Gandil and Eddie Seacott in New York in September of 1920, and then the big meeting in Chicago the week before the season ended in a hotel room in the Hotel Warner, with 6 of the ball players and Sports Sullivan and a man known to the players as forget what his. Rachel Brown was the name that he was known to the players on, and Rachel Brown was actually one of the people indicted. Rachel Brown was actually Nat Evans, who was a Arnold Rothstein confidant who was traveling under a surrogate. So that'll tell you about the quality of the investigation. They didn't even get the names on the indictments right.
So talk about that meeting. At some point, there's a meeting. The White Sox goes from 1 to 6. Then more, but at some point there's that aha moment where, all right, something's going down here, we're going to get a few bucks.
That was the meeting in the Hotel Warner on the Friday or Saturday night of before the season ended. The season ended on a Wednesday, I think, and it was in Eddie Seacott's room, and it included Gandil, Seacott, Lefty Williams, who was representing Joe Jackson, because when they said, "Is Jackson in?" Williams said, "Jackson will go along with whatever I say." Hap Felsch, the center fielder, Fred McMullen, the utility player, and Swede Risberg, the shortstop. Jackson was not there. Buck Weaver was not there. And Buck Weaver had already, Buck Weaver was there, but he said at that meeting that he would not be a party to anything. And it was at that where basically these players who had all had conversations with each other, and all of them with Gandil, said, "Well, all right, this is a go then. We're going to do it." And when Seacott got back to his room that night, he left to distract some other players who lived in the hotel, so that people wouldn't be seen leaving his room. When he got back to his room that night, there was an envelope with 10 $1,000 bills in it under his pillow. And so at that point, it was on.
So how was it supposed to play out? How was the money to be transferred? At what point did they have to produce? Was there a sign that had where the gamblers could look and say, "Aha, it's on"?
I'll give you an absolute, straightforward, rock-solid, factual answer. I don't know, and neither does anybody else who ever lived.
Honesty, wow.
And I think that's one of the reasons why we're so fascinated by this, because there are so many things. Again, 8 Men Out. Marvelous story. If it had been conceived as fiction or initially marketed, it was conceived as fiction, that Asimov wanted it to be a screenplay. Had it been marketed as a novel and not as history, nobody would have had any problem with it. But another of the fictions there is the fact that there was a sign that Eddie Seacott, who was pitching the first game, was to hit the first Cincinnati batter. And that would be a sign to the gamblers that the fix was in and that they could go ahead and lay off their money. And this came from an interview with Joe Williams of the World Telegram in the 1930s with Abe Adel, who was one of the factotums, one of the lesser, well, he was actually one of the critical figures on the gambling side. But he
boxing champion, so he was well known in the sports
he was very well known in the sports world and had entree into the sports world. But all of these rumors sort of bypassed, all of the rumors through the years bypassed Abe Adel, and I think he was feeling a little left out here. So he gave an interview to Joe Sullivan that purported to give the inside story, Joe Williams, excuse me, who was a columnist for the World Telegram in New York, and purported to give all the inside story of what had really happened. And it is fiction upon fiction upon fiction, which anyone who knew Abe Adel will tell you was his way of talking and his way of telling a story. But you know, if you look at it again on the surface of things, why would any of the gamblers have needed a sign? All of the money was laid off well in advance of the series, that the money that the big money went down very early when the odds were in the favor, when Cincinnati was a big underdog. By the time the series came around, the rumors had sort of evened out the betting odds, and the bets were sort of even money. That all the money was down well before that first pitch was thrown, and Seacott never alluded to that in any of his testimony, never said that I was trying to send a signal to anybody. Said, I think I was nervous and hit the first, player or something. But again, it makes for a nice story that, all right, here's the signal. Now the gamblers can fan out and start, laying off money. And, but it makes no sense. That, it was that as the word got around the gambling community, and the way the word got around was that the odds started dropping. More and more people started hedging their Chicago bets with Cincinnati bets. But by this time, Rothstein had already bet an estimated $300,000 on the Reds very early in the game.
Eddie Seacott gets 10 $1,000 bills on his pillow. Did anybody else get any money?
Yeah, that Lefty Williams got a packet with $10,000 in it and said, here, this is for you and Jackson. And this was after Game 4, and he went back to the hotel room they were sharing and gave Jackson his $5,000 and said, here's your dough, that's all we get. And said, who's double-crossed us? And at that point, they discussed their belief that it was Gandil that was double-crossing them. They had both been promised $20,000. Hap Felsch admitted to getting $5,000. We don't know how. Swede Risberg's mistress said that he had gotten $10,000, told one of Comiskey's private investigators that he had gotten $10,000. And so we can assume that if Felsch got $5,000, Jackson got $5,000, Williams got $5,000, Seacott got $10,000, Fred McMillan must have, or Risberg got $10,000, Fred McMillan must have gotten the same $5,000 that the others did. He was a utility player. Buck Weaver didn't take a penny. That left the rest of it from an estimated $80,000 to $100,000 that was given to Gandil by Nat Evans and Sport Sullivan. That meant that Gandil got the rest of it, or about $65,000. He claimed he never got a penny, and that the house he had bought the winter after the 1919 World Series had a mortgage on it.
This all occurred in 1919. It blew up in 1920. The grand jury investigated. There was a trial, and what was the result of the trial?
The trial was a swift acquittal for the players. And here's another, piece of the story that, the lawyers will love. The players were not charged with throwing a baseball game. There was no law, there was no statute on any book, no Cook County statute, no state of Illinois statute, no state of Ohio statute, no federal statute that made it illegal to throw a ball game. So if you look at the indictment, and you've got a copy of the indictment in the book, they were arrayed on a whole list of really arcane charges. And the most comprehensible of those was conspiracy to injure the business of another, their employer, Charles Comiskey. But you start explaining these charges to a jury, as the judge did in the criminal trial, it's very difficult for the jury to get their minds around, well, did they do that? And indeed, Judge Hugo Friend's directive to the jury said that you must, in order to find these players guilty, you must believe that their intention was not simply to lose the game, but to injure the business of Charles Comiskey and the Chicago White Sox. And, that was something that the jury, baseball fans or not, and they insisted that they followed the game. The 12 men that were on the jury said that they followed the game only casually, which was one of the reasons why they were acceptable as jurors. But, they deliberated for about an hour and a half, I guess, and then it was about 2.5 hours before the verdict was actually announced in court because the judge had gone out for dinner.
Judge Hartley, is that right? The acquittal occurs. The reaction of the players has got to be pretty relaxed and feeling good at that point?
The players were carried out of the courtroom on the shoulders of the people that were in the courtroom. That the courtroom was still full. It was 11:30 at night when the verdict was returned, and the courtroom was still full. And the verdict was announced, and chaos broke out. And the players went up and shook the jurors' hands, and the spectators were crawling over the railing, and the bailiffs were trying to restore order, but then they looked up and the judge was smiling and looking at the whole thing, so they just sort of let the scene play out, and the players were carried out of the courthouse on the shoulders of the spectators, and they celebrated in a nearby restaurant through the evening into the early morning hours, and sometime the next afternoon awoke probably somewhat the worse for their evening before to hear the news that Kennesaw Landis had issued a statement, the new commissioner brought in as a result of the Comiskey-Johnson acrimony, that in his first real act as commissioner, he issued a statement that said, no ball player who conspires to fix games and no ball player who sits in the presence where the ways and means of throwing a game are discussed will ever play Major League Baseball again. And by the time the ink was dry on that statement, the players' careers were over.
You talk about an ebb and a flow during one day, 24-hour cycle. Holy cow. What was the players obviously were stunned. Was Charles Comiskey just lost a third of his team through that act? Did he have any heads up that this would occur?
Oh yeah, that I think that he was preparing for this from the hour the 1919 World Series ended, because Gleason came to him, Kid Gleason, the manager, came to him the next day and said, well, they'd come to him during the series and said, look, I'm not convinced that all my players are on the square here. I think that some of them are, been compromised in this. And they went to Ban Johnson in his hotel room in the middle of the night and told him that story. And the White Sox were down 2-0 by this point. And Johnson's remark was, that is the whelp of a beaten cur, when he talked about Comiskey saying, my team's behind because my players aren't trying. And so, after the series was over, as I said, he had that meeting with Austrian. They hired private investigators, go find out what you can. And what the private investigators, who spent 3 months following the players, discovered was that there was really no smoking gun, that there were a lot of rumors, but there was nothing to suggest that there was anything that was going to come out and blow up. And it was at this point that Comiskey said, well, all right, I can offer these players contracts and I can go on with my plans for the 1920 season. But, certainly he knew knew that there was this potential for a ticking time bomb, which is why when that North American story broke, in the Philadelphia story broke, he went to Austrian and said, look, we've got to serve up to one or more of these players to the grand jury, otherwise I'm going to be swept away in this as well. It did sort of break his spirit that he wasn't the same engaged person that he was prior to 1919, after 1919. He turned over the day-to-day operation of the club to his basically would have been his general manager. He carried the title of team secretary, Harry Grabner, turned over the ceremonial duties to his son, and just sort of withdrew, you know, ever further from the team, and aged. You know, that you look at pictures from him of him in 1919 and pictures of him in 1921, and they're, you know, they look like they're 20 years apart, not 2 years apart.
You read in the Boston Globe that Pete Rose has just made a petition for reinstatement to Major League Baseball so that he could, if granted, he would be eligible for the Hall of Fame. You just wrote a book about the betrayal and dealing with the 8 White Sox who were involved in the same gambling, which, of course, banned Pete Rose and caught up in that net. Joe Jackson is probably the guy who's most likely to be in the Hall of Fame if you were reinstated. What was your sense? What was your feeling of that?
Well, my sense was whatever Rob Manfred ruled in that case was going to be hypocritical. That he was either going to rule against Pete Rose or rule in favor of Pete Rose and reinstate Pete Rose, and in so doing, leave the Black Sox out on the outside, leave Joe Jackson out on the outside, which would have been a little hypocritical. That, you know, Jackson never, you know, he took the money, but he never admitted to throwing a single game. There was nothing against in the rules of baseball against that at the time. There very clearly was when Rose did it. He walked past that sign in the locker room every day that said violation of this, you know, baseball rule 21 will result in a permanent banishment from the game. So if he reinstated Rose, he would have been hypocritical. But in banning Rose, and at the same time, you know, saying, make sure that, you know, you guys all follow our daily fantasy partner, DraftKings, you know, that he's being just as hypocritical. That, you know, what is daily fantasy if not gambling on baseball? And Major League Baseball now has an official partnership with that. So, you know, there's the hypocrisy, you know, abounds, and it all goes back to the same thing that 1919 went back to, which was money.
So we put this book on the shelf. The Betrayal goes up. And by the way, there are just a few of these left if anybody's interested in them. Susan Murphy right there has them, 3 books left. So if you want them, get them signed. So it goes up on the shelf. What's the legacy? Years from now, it goes up and people look at it and adding to the body of knowledge of that whole story of the Black Sox scandal. What do you hope people will remember you by?
I hope the book stands up. I hope that the conversation that will continue on this is a conversation that shows this story in good light. That, you know, as we talk more about it, as I don't know how many more discoveries we'll have in this, but it's possible somebody's old letters or papers might unearth to shed another small piece of light on this. But as we continue to discuss it, as we continue to discuss its significance and consequence in the history of American sport, I would hope the legacy of the book is that it stands up, that people find a reason to read it in 20 years and 50 years from now.
I'm sure they will, because this is so fascinating. Ladies and gentlemen, Chet Fountain.
Thank you.